The wind howled through the night, its icy breath cutting through the darkness like a blade. Snow swirled violently in the air, blanketing the ground in thick, untouched white. The temperature had plummeted to 25 degrees, the kind of unbearable cold that seeped into bones and stole away the warmth of life itself. In the middle of it all, standing alone on the side of a desolate road, was Ace. The German shepherd shivered violently, his thick coat no longer enough to protect him from the cruel bite of winter. His paws, raw and frozen, ached with every step. His breath came out in short, ragged puffs of steam that quickly disappeared into the wind. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but it was nothing compared to the loneliness that clutched at his heart. He had been abandoned. Hours ago, maybe longer, time had become meaningless in this frozen wasteland. He had watched his owner drive away, leaving him standing in the snow with nothing but the last command he had been given: stay. Ace had obeyed, his loyal heart clinging to the belief that his owner would return. But the minutes stretched into hours, and reality sank in like a stone in his chest. No one was coming back for him. Now, all he had left was the faint hope that someone else, some kind stranger, would stop and save him. His ears perked at the distant sound of an approaching car. Ace's heart pounded with anticipation. His tired tail gave a weak wag as headlights cut through the darkness, growing closer. Maybe this was it. Maybe someone would see him, take pity on him, and give him the warmth he so desperately needed. The car sped past without slowing down. Ace's tail dropped. His ears flattened against his head. Another car came. Another chance. He stepped forward, his weak body trembling as he lifted his head higher, trying to make himself seen. But just like the last one, this car also ignored him, its red taillights fading into the distance. Car after car, Ace watched them all pass by. Some drivers glanced his way, their faces barely visible through frosted windshields, but none of them stopped. None of them cared. His hope was fading. The cold was relentless, wrapping around him like chains. His legs felt heavier with every passing minute. His body, once strong and proud, sagged with exhaustion. For the first time in his life, Ace felt completely and utterly alone. His paws ached from standing on the ice for so long. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, for warmth, for something, anything, that would take away this suffocating cold. But he couldn't give in. If he lay down now, he might never get back up. Then another car appeared in the distance. Ace's ears perked. His tail twitched with the last flicker of hope in his heart. The car slowed. His breath hitched. His body tensed in anticipation. Then the car came to a complete stop. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, his face barely visible under the glow of the headlights. He was middle-aged, bundled in a thick coat and gloves, his breath visible in the freezing air. Ace took a hesitant step forward. The man didn't move closer. He simply stood there, staring at Ace with an unreadable expression. For a moment, there was silence, nothing but the howling wind and the distant hum of the car engine. Then the man sighed. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Ace's ears twitched. Without another word, the man got back into his car. The door slammed shut. The engine roared. The car drove away, its tires kicking up snow as it disappeared into the darkness. Ace stood there, frozen, not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of disappointment. His tail hung limp. His body sagged. The last of his hope shattered like ice beneath heavy boots. The world had abandoned him, and this time he truly had no one left. Ace let out a low whimper and sank to the ground, his body curling in on itself. The cold pressed in from all sides, stealing away what little warmth he had left. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, began to close. If this was the end, he didn't want to fight it anymore. But then, a sound, not the wind, not another passing car. It was different, a screeching of tires, a loud thud. Ace's ears perked. His eyes snapped open. He forced himself up, his stiff muscles screaming in protest. His body swayed, weak and unsteady, but he turned his head toward the sound. A figure emerged from the darkness. Someone was walking toward him. This time, they weren't just passing by. This time, they weren't leaving him behind. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a small ember of hope flickered in Ace's heart. The world was still wrapped in cold darkness, but something had changed. Ace's body, weak from hunger and exhaustion, trembled as he stared at the approaching figure. His breath was shallow, forming small clouds in the freezing air. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stay upright. Was this real? Was someone actually coming for him? The figure walked steadily, each step crunching through the thick snow. Ace squinted through the icy wind, trying to make out the person's face. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat. His hands were gloved, his boots sturdy against the frozen ground. His hat was pulled low, shielding most of his face, but there was something different about the way he moved. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't turning away. Ace's heart pounded in his chest. The man knelt down a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't lunge, didn't make any sudden gestures. Instead, he simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. Food. The scent hit Ace instantly. His empty stomach clenched, his hunger overriding his fear. The man placed the food on the ground and leaned back, giving Ace space. "Go on, boy," the man said gently. "It's okay." Ace hesitated. His instincts screamed caution. Humans had let him down before. They had lied, abandoned him, left him to die in the cold. But the smell of food was too strong. His legs moved on their own, his paws dragging against the icy road as he crept closer. He sniffed the offering, small pieces of kibble, slightly crushed from being in the man's pocket, but real. One. His tongue flicked out, tasting the food. The instant it touched his mouth, a rush of warmth spread through his body. He devoured the rest in quick, desperate bites, barely able to chew. The man didn't move, just watched. "You're a strong one," he murmured. "You've been out here for a while, huh?" Ace lifted his head, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. His amber eyes, dulled by exhaustion, searched for any sign of deception. He found none. The man didn't turn away. He didn't climb back into his car and drive off like the others. He was still here. Ace's tail twitched. The man reached out, slowly, carefully. His gloved fingers hovered near Ace's head, not forcing contact. Offering. Ace flinched, his body instinctively preparing for a hit. But it never came. Instead, the man's fingers brushed lightly against his ear, warm even through the fabric of the gloves. The touch was hesitant, testing, as if waiting to see if Ace would bolt. Ace didn't move. "You've got a tough spirit, don't you?" The man smiled slightly. "But you don't have to be alone anymore." The words settled deep in Ace's chest. He didn't understand them, not fully, but something about them felt different. The man stood, dusting snow off his coat. Then he turned and walked toward his car. Ace's breath hitched. No, not again. He had let himself believe, just for a moment, that this man was different, that he wasn't like the others who had passed him by. But now he was leaving. Ace's body tensed, his heart pounded, his legs felt like stone. He wanted to move, to follow, to chase after the only kindness he had felt in so long. Then, the man stopped. He turned back, his hand resting on the open car door. His eyes met Ace's once more, and this time there was no hesitation. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Let's get you out of the cold." Ace's body moved before he could think. His paws crunched against the snow as he took a step, then another, and another. The man didn't rush him. He simply held the door open, waiting. Ace hesitated at the threshold. The inside of the car was warm, so warm that he could feel the heat radiating from within. The scent of leather, the faint, lingering smell of coffee, it was so different from the frozen wasteland outside. For a moment, he looked back at the road, the snow-covered stretch of emptiness where he had spent so many lonely, freezing hours. Then he looked up at the man. This was a choice. And for the first time in his life, Ace chose to trust. He stepped inside. The moment the door closed behind him, a wave of warmth wrapped around him like a blanket. He curled into the seat instinctively, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer relief of feeling warmth again. The car rumbled to life, and the man reached over, gently adjusting the heating vents to blow warm air in Ace's direction. "That's better, huh?" he murmured. Ace let out a low sigh and rested his head on the seat. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't shivering. The drive was quiet. Ace's body ached, exhaustion weighing him down like a heavy stone, but he forced himself to stay awake. He didn't want to close his eyes, not yet. Not until he knew this was real. The man drove with steady hands, his gaze flicking toward Ace every so often. "You're lucky I was driving by," he said after a while. "That storm's gonna get worse." Ace didn't know what that meant. All he knew was that the farther they drove, the more the fear inside him started to loosen its grip. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowed. The man turned onto a smaller road, lined with trees and blanketed in fresh snow. Then, finally, they stopped. Ace lifted his head. A house. Not large, not fancy. Just a simple, warm-looking home with a soft glow of light spilling from the windows. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, disappearing into the night sky. Ace's ears flicked forward. The man opened his door and stepped out, then walked around to the passenger side, opening Ace's door. "Come on, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you inside." Ace hesitated. The cold wind rushed back in, nipping at his fur, reminding him of everything he had just escaped. But then the man stepped back, giving him space, and Ace realized he wasn't being forced. This was his decision. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. His paws hit the soft snow, but this time it didn't feel as cruel. The man led him toward the house, up the small wooden steps and through the door. Warmth. It hit him instantly, wrapping around him like an embrace. The scent of wood and something faintly sweet filled the air. A fireplace crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering light across the room. Ace stood frozen in the doorway, unsure. The man knelt beside him, reaching out a hand, but again, not forcing. Just offering. "You're safe now," he murmured. "This is home." Home. Ace didn't know what that word truly meant, but as he stepped inside, his body relaxing in the warmth, he decided maybe he could learn. The warmth of the house wrapped around Ace like a long-forgotten embrace. His body, once stiff from the freezing cold, was finally beginning to thaw. His paws tingled as sensation returned, a sharp contrast to the numbness he had grown used to. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the wooden floors. For a long moment, Ace just stood there, hesitant. Could he really trust this? He had spent so much time alone, shivering in the cold, watching car after car pass him by. He had learned that humans couldn't be trusted, that kindness was fleeting, that love was conditional. Every instinct in his body told him to be cautious, to keep his guard up. But this man, Lucas, hadn't abandoned him. Lucas stood by the door, watching him carefully but not pushing. He didn't grab Ace, didn't force him forward. He simply waited, giving Ace time to adjust. "You can take all the time you need, buddy," Lucas said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." Safe. Ace wasn't sure what that word meant anymore. But as he cautiously stepped further into the house, he realized something. He wasn't afraid. Lucas led Ace to a small, cozy corner of the living room, near the fireplace. A thick plush dog bed sat there, freshly laid out as if it had been waiting for him. Beside it was a bowl of water, another filled with food. Ace's stomach clenched at the sight of the food. He hadn't eaten a real meal in what felt like forever. His ribs still ached from hunger, and his body felt weak from days, weeks of starvation. The small bits of kibble Lucas had given him earlier had barely been enough to take the edge off. But even now, staring at the food in front of him, he hesitated. His past had taught him that food wasn't always safe. His old owners had sometimes left scraps for him, but only if he had been good. Other times, He had been yelled at for eating when he wasn't supposed to. Would Lucas take the food away if Ace moved too quickly? Would he get angry? Ace glanced at Lucas, his body tense. Lucas didn't react. He simply walked over to the couch and sat down, giving Ace space. "You can eat," Lucas said softly. "It's yours." Ace hesitated a moment longer before slowly stepping forward. He lowered his head, sniffing the food. It smelled real. Safe. He took a tentative bite, then another. The moment the food hit his stomach, his body nearly sagged with relief. He ate faster, unable to control himself, as if the food would disappear if he didn't finish quickly. Lucas didn't scold him. He didn't take the bowl away. He simply watched, his expression soft. "You've been through a lot, huh?" Lucas murmured. Ace barely registered the words. He was too focused on eating, on the warmth in his belly, on the feeling of finally being full for the first time in so long. When the bowl was empty, Ace licked his lips, his body still trembling from exhaustion. He turned, expecting to see disappointment in Lucas's eyes. But there was none. Instead, Lucas smiled. "Good boy." Something in Ace's chest tightened. It had been so long since he had heard those words. The first night was the hardest. Ace lay curled up in his new bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, the creak of the wooden floors, the hum of the heater, the wind howling outside, kept him on edge. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to shut down. He had spent too many nights out in the cold, too many nights waiting for something to go wrong. At some point, Lucas turned off the lights and went to bed, leaving the house bathed in darkness. Ace tensed, listening carefully. He had always been alone at night. He had learned to stay alert, to never let his guard down. But here, there was no cold biting at his skin. No hunger gnawing at his stomach, just warmth and silence. Ace shifted, resting his head on his paws. His eyelids felt heavy. The fire still crackled softly in the distance, a steady rhythm that lulled him into something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Peace. Before he could stop himself, his body relaxed, and for the first time in months, Ace fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The days that followed were filled with cautious steps forward. Lucas didn't push Ace to do anything. He let him adjust at his own pace. In the mornings, he would kneel beside Ace's bed and offer him a soft, "Good morning, buddy," before placing down fresh food and water. Ace would eat hesitantly at first, always watching for any sign of anger. But Lucas never showed any. When Lucas went outside, Ace would follow, carefully, slowly. He never strayed too far from the door, never let himself get too comfortable. But with each passing day, he wandered just a little further. Lucas was patient. He never forced Ace to play, never expected immediate trust. Instead, he simply existed beside him, giving Ace time to understand that this new life was real. And slowly, piece by piece, Ace began to believe it. One afternoon, Lucas knelt beside Ace with something in his hand. A leash. Ace stiffened immediately, his ears flattening. His last owner had used a leash, but not in a way that was kind. The memories flashed in his mind like a nightmare. The harsh tug, the choking pressure, the yelling. Lucas noticed Ace's reaction and paused. "Easy," Lucas said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you." Ace stood frozen, his heart pounding. Lucas didn't force the leash on him. Instead, he set it down on the floor between them and sat back. Ace watched warily. A few minutes passed, then a few more. Lucas remained still, giving Ace time. Finally, cautiously, Ace took a small step forward and sniffed the leash. It smelled different. Not of anger, not of fear, just leather. Lucas smiled. "Good boy." Ace's tail gave a hesitant wag. That evening, for the first time, Lucas took Ace on a walk. It was slow, cautious. Ace stayed close, his body tense, his ears swiveling at every noise. The world outside was still unfamiliar, still overwhelming. But Lucas never pulled. Never forced. He simply walked beside Ace, his presence steady, unwavering. At one point, they reached a small clearing where the snow had started to melt. The air smelled fresh, clean. Ace paused, his nose twitching at the sense of the earth beneath the frost. Lucas knelt beside him, reaching out. Ace flinched, but Lucas didn't pull away. Instead, he scratched lightly behind Ace's ears, his touch warm and reassuring. "You're safe now," Lucas murmured. Ace exhaled slowly, and for the first time, he believed it. The cold, endless nights of suffering felt like a distant memory now. Ace still woke up sometimes expecting the bite of the wind on his skin, the gnawing hunger in his belly, and the emptiness of abandonment. But each morning as he opened his eyes, he was greeted by something new. Warmth. The comforting scent of a home, the soft sound of Lucas moving about, the steady rhythm of a life that was beginning to feel safe. Ace had begun to settle into this new world, but there was still a part of him that hesitated, that held back. He had learned too many harsh lessons from humans, and trust was not something he could give easily. But Lucas never forced anything. He let Ace come to him in his own time, allowed him to explore the house and the yard at his own pace. And slowly, Ace began to accept that maybe, just maybe, this life was real. Each morning now started the same way. Lucas would wake up early, stretching with a groggy yawn before heading to the kitchen to start his coffee. By the time the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Ace would be awake too, lifting his head from his bed and watching as Lucas moved around. "Morning, bud," Lucas would say, his voice always gentle, always warm. He would kneel beside Ace's bed, holding out a hand but never pushing for contact. Some mornings, Ace would sniff his fingers before looking away, still unsure. Other mornings, he would lean forward, just a little, letting Lucas stroke his head. Lucas never made a big deal of it. "Good boy," he would say softly, then stand and head to the kitchen. The words never carried any expectation, just quiet, steady reassurance. Ace was starting to believe them. Lucas had started taking Ace on walks through the backyard every afternoon. At first, Ace had been reluctant, sticking close to the house, wary of the open space. But the more they walked, the more he began to explore. The wind didn't feel as harsh anymore. The ground beneath his paws wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was solid, safe. And Lucas was always there. Ace had learned to recognize the sound of Lucas's voice, the rhythm of his footsteps, the steady, calming presence that never left his side. And that alone gave him the courage to take another step forward. One day, as they walked near the fence, Ace paused. His ears twitched as he listened to the distant sound of children laughing. It was a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. Lucas noticed. "That's the park," Lucas explained. "We'll go there when you're ready." Ace didn't know what ready meant. He didn't know if he would ever be ready, but he took a step closer to the sound. And Lucas smiled. The first real sign of joy came unexpectedly. It was a simple moment, something that might have gone unnoticed if Lucas hadn't been paying attention. They were in the living room. Lucas was reading on the couch, and Ace was lying on his bed near the fireplace. The house was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fire. Then, out of nowhere, Lucas let out a chuckle. Ace lifted his head. Lucas had his phone in his hand, shaking his head as he laughed at something on the screen. Ace watched him, confused. He wasn't used to laughter, not the kind that wasn't cruel, not the kind that wasn't followed by shouting. But there was something warm in the sound, something that made the room feel lighter. Ace's ears perked up, his head tilted slightly, and then, without thinking, his tail gave a small wag. Just once, just a little. Lucas didn't see it at first, but when he glanced over at Ace, his eyes softened. "That's a good sound, huh?" he said, setting his phone down. Ace blinked. Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't move closer, didn't try to make the moment into something bigger than it was. He just smiled. And this time, when Ace's tail wagged again, just a little, Lucas noticed. The biggest breakthrough came a few days later. Lucas had brought home something new, a simple rubber ball. He set it down on the floor, rolling it lightly toward Ace. Ace stiffened at first. It wasn't fear exactly, but uncertainty. He didn't understand what Lucas wanted him to do. Lucas didn't force it. Instead, he picked up the ball and rolled it again, just a little closer. Ace watched. Then, carefully, he reached out with his paw and tapped the ball, sending it rolling a few inches away. Lucas's smile widened. "Good boy." The word sent a small flicker of warmth through Ace's chest. Lucas rolled the ball again, and this time, Ace caught it between his paws. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, without thinking, he opened his mouth and picked it up. Lucas chuckled. "You want to play, bud?" Ace didn't know if he wanted to play. He didn't know if he even remembered how. But when Lucas reached for the ball, Ace pulled back slightly, gripping it tighter. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I see how it is," he teased. "You want me to work for it, huh?" Something about Lucas's playful tone made Ace's tail wag. Just a little. Lucas lunged forward, pretending to grab the ball, and Ace pulled back again, holding on to his prize. And then, before he could stop himself, Ace let out a soft, playful growl. Lucas froze. Ace tensed immediately, his body going rigid. Had he done something wrong? Had he ruined it? But Lucas just grinned. "Now that's more like it." He reached out again, and this time Ace let him take the ball. Lucas held it up. "You ready?" Ace didn't know what he was ready for, but when Lucas tossed the ball a few feet away, Ace ran after it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt happy. From that moment on, things were different. Ace still had moments of hesitation. There were still times when the past crept up on him, whispering doubts into his mind. But now, those moments were fewer. Now, he had something to look forward to. Now when Lucas reached out his hand, Ace didn't flinch. Now when Lucas laughed, Ace wagged his tail. And now when Lucas tossed the ball across the room, Ace ran after it. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but because he wanted to. Because he was learning that life wasn't just about survival. It was about joy. Ace had come a long way from the abandoned, shivering dog on the side of the road. The cold, empty nights were behind him now, replaced by warmth, safety, and something he never thought he would have again, love. Lucas had become more than just the man who rescued him. He was a constant presence, a protector, and in a way the family Ace had lost. Their bond was growing stronger with each passing day, built not just on kindness but on trust, something Ace had once thought was impossible to feel again. But trust wasn't built overnight. It came in small moments. A hand reaching out, not to harm, but to comfort. A voice calling his name, not with anger, but with patience. A home, not just a shelter, but a place where he belonged. And slowly, Ace was beginning to believe that this new life was real. It had been months since Lucas first brought Ace home, but every night had still carried a shadow of the past. Ace never slept deeply. Even in the warmth of his bed, surrounded by the quiet safety of Lucas's house, he remained alert, his ears always twitching at the slightest sound. The memories of the streets, of the freezing nights and the hunger were still too fresh. But one night, something changed. Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. The dim glow of the lamp cast soft shadows across the living room, the fireplace crackling quietly. Ace, as usual, lay on his bed near the fireplace. But tonight, for the first time, he did something different. He stood up. His paws moved cautiously across the wooden floor, his eyes fixed on Lucas. He hesitated for a long moment, his heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and rested his head against the couch near Lucas's hand. Lucas stirred slightly, blinking awake. When he saw Ace standing there, so close, so trusting, he smiled. "Hey, bud," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He reached out, running his fingers gently through Ace's fur. Ace didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch. Lucas let out a soft chuckle, his fingers continuing to stroke Ace's head. "You finally decided to join me, huh?" Ace let out a small sigh, closing his eyes. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to sleep, not with one eye open, not on edge, but in the comfort of knowing he was safe. The next morning, Lucas stood by the door, holding Ace's leash. "You ready, bud?" he asked. Ace eyed the leash warily. He hadn't left the yard much since arriving at Lucas's home. The world outside still felt too big, too unpredictable. But Lucas had been patient, never forcing him. And now Ace felt something different. The urge to step beyond the boundaries of his safe space. To explore, not out of desperation but out of curiosity. With a deep breath, he walked over to Lucas. Lucas smiled, clipping the leash onto his collar. "Let's take it slow, okay?" And together, they stepped outside. The world was still the same streets, the same sounds of passing cars, the same distant hum of the city, but it didn't feel the same to Ace anymore. Because this time, he wasn't alone. As they approached the park, Ace's ears perked up at the sound of children laughing. Dogs ran freely across the grass, their tails wagging, their bodies full of energy and life. Ace hesitated. Lucas knelt beside him, his hand resting lightly on Ace's back. "It's okay," he said softly. "We don't have to go in if you don't want to." Ace looked up at him. There was no force in Lucas's voice, no pressure, just understanding. Ace took a deep breath, and then he took a step forward. Lucas grinned. "That's my boy." They walked into the park together, the sun warm against their backs. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ace didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged. At first, Ace simply walked beside Lucas, his eyes scanning everything around him. The rustling of the leaves, the chatter of people, the distant bark of other dogs, every sound was new, but none of it felt threatening. Lucas let him set the pace, never pulling on the leash, just letting him take everything in. And then something unexpected happened. A small black Labrador puppy darted across the grass, chasing after a bright yellow tennis ball. The pup yipped excitedly, bounding after the ball with pure, unfiltered joy. Ace froze. He had seen other dogs play before, but he had never played himself. Lucas noticed. "You want to try?" Ace looked up at him. Lucas knelt down, unclipping the leash. Ace hesitated. Then, Lucas pulled a ball from his pocket. He rolled it across the grass. Not too far, just enough to see if Ace would react. Ace watched the ball roll. Something stirred inside him, something buried deep beneath the pain and the fear. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his paws kicking up bits of dirt as he sprinted after the ball. The wind rushed past him, his legs moving freely for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. When he reached the ball, he stopped, panting, the weight of it resting in his jaws. Lucas's laughter rang out behind him. "Attaboy, Ace." Ace turned, ball still in his mouth, and for the first time since he had been abandoned, his tail wagged. Not just a small twitch, a full, happy, uncontrollable wag. Lucas's smile softened. "That's it, bud," he murmured. "That's what I've been waiting for." Ace trotted back toward him, dropping the ball at Lucas's feet. Lucas picked it up, ruffling Ace's fur. "You want to go again?" Ace didn't hesitate this time. He barked, loud, clear, and full of excitement. Lucas laughed. All right. Let's do this." And for the first time in his new life, Ace wasn't just surviving. He was living. The walk home was quiet. Ace stayed close to Lucas, his body no longer tense, no longer uncertain. He knew now. Lucas wasn't going to leave. This wasn't temporary. This was real. As they stepped inside, Lucas unhooked Ace's leash and patted his head. "You did good today," he said. "I'm proud of you." Ace leaned into him, pressing his head against Lucas's chest. Lucas let out a breath, his arms wrapping around the dog in a firm, steady hug. Ace didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he stayed right there, soaking in the warmth, the safety, the love. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a stray, wasn't just a lost soul waiting to be rescued. He was home. And Lucas was his person. His family, his forever. Time had passed, and Ace's life had completely changed. From a trembling dog abandoned in the freezing cold, he now had a home, a companion, and, most importantly, a new life. Every morning, Ace woke up in the warmth of his small home, sunlight streaming softly through the window. Lucas was always there, sometimes drinking coffee, sometimes reading a book, but always greeting Ace with a smile. Ace was no longer a frightened dog, haunted by his past. But the past, sometimes, it wasn't so easy to escape. One morning, Lucas decided to take Ace on a longer walk than usual. Instead of their usual route around the neighborhood, they ventured further, following a small road that led to the outskirts of town. Everything was peaceful. Ace enjoyed the new scents, sniffing every flower, every tree. The wind was gentle against his fur, nothing like the biting, cruel winds of that fateful night. But then, as they turned a corner, Ace froze. His breathing became heavy. His eyes widened, his legs trembling as if his body wanted to run, but he didn't know where. Lucas noticed immediately. He knelt beside Ace, his hand resting gently on the dog's back. "What is it, buddy?" Ace couldn't take his eyes off the house in front of him. An old house, with a weathered wooden fence and dusty windows, and in the front yard, a man stood there, rummaging through his garage. Lucas didn't recognize him, but Ace did. His heart nearly stopped. It was him. The man who had abandoned him in the freezing night, his old owner. Lucas could feel the tension in Ace's body. His breath was shaky, his eyes filled with something between fear and confusion. Then Lucas looked up. The man had noticed them. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then the man frowned and took a step toward the fence. "Hey, that's my dog," he said, his voice rough and indifferent. Lucas felt anger surge through him. "What did you just say?" he asked, his eyes locked onto the man. "That's my dog. He ran away a few months ago." Lucas clenched his fists. "Ran away?" He let out a cold laugh. "Or did you throw him out in the middle of the night and drive off without looking back?" The man shrugged. "I couldn't take care of him anymore. A dog is just a dog. I figured he was dead by now." Those words felt like a knife to Lucas's heart. He looked down at Ace. The dog was still standing there. Not growling, not attacking, just staring at the man with an expression Lucas couldn't quite read. The man glanced at Ace one last time before shrugging again. "But if you found him, then good for you. I don't need him." Then, just like that, he turned away, as if Ace had never mattered. Lucas gritted his teeth, his hands shaking with the urge to punch the man in the face. But instead, he knelt beside Ace and gently stroked his fur. "It's okay, Ace," he whispered. "He's not worth it." Ace kept staring at the man for a few more moments, then slowly turned away. And that was it. Ace had made his choice. The past no longer mattered. Ace didn't need the man who had abandoned him. He had a new family now. Someone who truly loved him. On the walk back home, Lucas could feel a difference in Ace. The tension in his body had melted away. Ace had faced his past, and he had moved on. When they arrived home, Ace did something he had never done before. He jumped onto the couch, curled up beside Lucas, and rested his head on the man's lap. Lucas was stunned for a moment, then smiled, gently stroking Ace's soft fur. "Well, looks like you've officially taken my spot now, huh?" Ace didn't answer, but the slow wag of his tail said everything. Lucas chuckled and leaned back into the couch. It was finally over. Ace was no longer an abandoned dog. He no longer belonged to a man who never cared about him. He belonged here. He belonged with Lucas. The encounter with his past had changed something in Ace. The dog who had once been afraid, hesitant, and burdened by memories now walked with his head higher, his steps lighter. The ghost of abandonment that had once haunted him was gone. Ace was no longer waiting for someone to come back for him, because now he knew. He already had a home. The days that followed were peaceful. Ace settled even more comfortably into life with Lucas. He no longer hesitated before entering the house. He no longer flinched at sudden movements. He no longer looked over his shoulder, expecting someone to take him away. He was home. One evening, as Lucas sat on the couch with a book in his hands, Ace came over and rested his head on his lap. Lucas smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You're really happy here, huh, buddy?" Ace let out a contented sigh. Lucas had never considered himself someone who needed companionship. His life had been simple before Ace. Wake up, work, come home, repeat. But now, Things were different. Now there were early morning walks with Ace by his side, greeting the sunrise together. Now there was the sound of paws padding across the wooden floor, a quiet presence that made the house feel alive. Now there was a bond, one that neither of them had expected, but had come to mean everything. Lucas smiled down at Ace. "I guess we saved each other, huh?" Ace wagged his tail as if he understood. And in truth, maybe he did. One weekend, Lucas decided to take Ace somewhere special. He had been wanting to do this for a while, but he needed to make sure Ace was ready. Today, he was. Lucas packed a small bag with snacks, water, and Ace's favorite toy before leading him to the car. Ace hesitated for a moment, still cautious of cars after his past experience. But when Lucas opened the door and patted the seat, Ace took a deep breath and hopped in. Lucas smiled proudly. "That's my boy." As they drove, Ace watched the world outside the window with curiosity. They were heading toward a place that Lucas used to visit as a kid, a large open field surrounded by trees, where dogs could run freely without fences or roads nearby. When they arrived, Ace's ears perked up as he took in the wide expanse of green. Lucas opened the car door. For a moment, Ace just stood there, taking in the fresh air. Then, as if realizing what this place meant, he took off running. Lucas laughed, watching Ace sprint through the grass with pure, unfiltered joy. His legs were strong now, his body full of life. No longer weak, no longer afraid. Lucas ran after him, and for the next hour they played together. Fetch, chase, rolling in the grass like kids. Ace was free. Truly, completely free. That night, after they returned home, Lucas sat on the couch with something in his hands. A brand new collar. Not just any collar. This one had a tag engraved with Ace's name. Lucas knelt in front of him, gently fastening it around his neck. "There," he murmured, stepping back to admire it. "Now it's official." Ace wagged his tail, his golden eyes shining with something deeper than just happiness. He understood. This collar wasn't just an accessory. It was a promise that he would never be abandoned again, a promise that he had a home, a family, forever. Time passed, and life settled into something beautiful. Ace became a part of everything Lucas did. He sat by his feet while he worked, keeping him company. He greeted him every morning with a wagging tail, eager for their walks. He stayed by his side every night, watching over him just as Lucas had watched over him. One evening, Lucas sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Ace sat beside him, his head resting on Lucas's knee. "You know, Ace," Lucas said softly, "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you that night." Ace let out a soft huff, as if to say, "Me neither." Lucas smiled, running a hand through his fur. "But I'm glad I did." Ace closed his eyes, content. He had once stood alone in the freezing snow, waiting for someone to save him. Now he was here. Warm, loved, home, and he knew with absolute certainty he would never be alone again.